In the bitter winter of 1745, deep in the Mohawk Valley of New York, something horrifying unfolded. An event so meticulously buried by colonial authorities that the truth wouldn't surface for nearly 300 years. 17 families were wiped out. 43 men, women, and children met their deaths in a series of coordinated raids that seemed far too deliberate to be coincidence. The survivors spoke of an unseen force, someone orchestrating the destruction with the precision of a military strategist. They called him a ghost, a whisper, a puppet master no one could see. What they never could have imagined was that this so-called puppet master was not a commander, not a spy, not even a man. It was an 11-year-old boy, a child who spoke 3 languages fluently and understood human fear better than most grown men ever could. His name was Jonas Kryton. That name appears in only 3 surviving colonial records from that winter, each marked with a mysterious notation later decoded to mean sealed by gubernatorial order. Those 3 documents are the only official traces left of a child who turned conflict into profit, chaos into strategy, and war into something disturbingly personal. The truth about Jonas didn't emerge from government archives or family letters. It came decades later from the dying confession of a Mohawk elder in 1823. His story was recorded by a missionary who, terrified by what he'd heard, sealed the account and begged his church never to release it. For over a century it remained locked away. At that time, the Mohawk Valley was still frontier, isolated settlements scattered across harsh wilderness. King George's War had turned New York into a battlefield where the French and the British fought by proxy through alliances with native tribes. Every family living along that valley existed in constant fear of being swept up in raids that could come without warning. Fort Hunter stood as the main trading outpost in the region, a cluster of wooden buildings surrounded by a 12-foot palisade. Inside that small fortress lived Hamish Creighton, a Scottish immigrant who had come from Glasgow in 1738. He was one of the most successful arms dealers on the colonial frontier. Hamish had a sharp mind for business and an instinct for how to profit from instability. He knew that war was good for trade. The more frightened people became, the more they bought weapons, and Hamish had plenty to sell. His household mirrored the chaotic diversity of frontier life. 2 Mohawk interpreters, a French trapper who'd switched sides, and a former indentured servant from Virginia who kept the books. His wife, Margaret, had died giving birth to their only child, Jonas. From the moment he could walk, Jonas grew up surrounded by talk of war. He watched his father negotiate over muskets and powder, listening to conversations that balanced between diplomacy and bloodshed. By 7, he spoke English, Dutch, and Mohawk fluently. The boy had a quiet intensity, gray eyes that seemed to study people rather than look at them. He absorbed everything. By 1744, tensions in the valley had reached their breaking point. The French, under Captain Paul Marouin, were pushing south from Lake Champlain. War parties allied with them, the Abenaki and Huron, were suddenly armed with new British weapons, suspiciously similar to those Hamish Creighton was known to trade. One spring morning, Hamish received an unexpected visitor, Captain Edmund Stockwell of the New York Colonial Militia. The officer brought troubling news. Someone was selling weapons to both sides, arming the French allied tribes while also supplying colonial militias. It was more than treason. It was a death sentence for families caught in the middle. On June 14, 1745, the day dawned eerily calm. Jonas sat in his father's study, carefully copying inventory records in his perfect, adult-like handwriting. Through the window, he noticed 2 Mohawk men approaching. He recognized them instantly. Karonhiati and Konwatiti, trusted intermediaries who often brought news from the French. The men entered the trading post with grave faces. They said the French captain needed more of the fire sticks, specifically the ones with the silver bands around the stock. Outside in the shadows, a group of Huron warriors waited. Hamish agreed, though cautiously, raising the price, citing the danger of British patrols. When the Mohawks left, Jonas turned to his father with that calculating look he often had. "What if the British found out the French were buying those weapons, father?" he asked softly. "Wouldn't they pay for that information?" Hamish frowned, ready to dismiss the thought, but the idea lingered, and that's how the seed was planted. Not by a scheming merchant, but by an 11-year-old boy. Within a week, Hamish reached out to British intelligence, offering to act as a double agent. What he didn't know was that Jonas had already begun sending his own letters to military commanders, traders, and tribal leaders written in 3 different languages. Jonas's first manipulation began with something small. 2 Dutch traders at Fort Hunter were talking about a prosperous family nearby, the Vanderbergs. Peter and Greer Vanderberg had a thriving farm on the Mohawk River, trading goods and herbs with settlers and soldiers alike. But recently, Peter had begun dealing directly with French agents, cutting out intermediaries like Hamish Creighton and hurting the family's profits. Jonas saw opportunity. He visited the Vanderberg farm, pretending to deliver a message from his father about a sick trader needing medicine. While Greer prepared her remedies, Jonas chatted with Peter, pretending to be curious about French soldiers. "Papa said some farmers are helping the French hide from British patrols," he said innocently. "He says it's dangerous for them if the British ever find out." Peter looked uneasy. Jonas pressed further, adding just enough detail to sound believable, but not enough to be confirmed. A few days later, Peter marched into Fort Hunter, demanding to prove his loyalty to the Crown. That meeting, arranged by Hamish's contacts, put the Vanderbergs on a list of families under surveillance, exactly where Jonas wanted them. He then told a Huron war party that the Vanderbergs were sheltering British officers and helping capture French scouts. To the British, he spread the opposite story, that the Vanderbergs were secretly helping the French. In one stroke, he made both sides see the same family as a threat. On July 12th, both forces converged. The Hurons attacked, expecting to find British officers. The British militia, arriving at the same time, thought they were rescuing loyal colonists from a French raid. In less than an hour, Peter, Greer, their children, and more than a dozen soldiers and warriors lay dead. From a distance, Jonas watched the smoke rise from the ruins of the farm. The experiment had worked. He had learned how easily fear could be weaponized, how the right lie, whispered to the right person, could do more damage than gunpowder ever could. In the days that followed, Hamish's sales soared. Dutch settlers bought muskets in panic. British officers purchased pistols to arm patrols. French intermediaries stocked up to supply their tribal allies. All because one family's tragedy had reignited every faction's paranoia. Jonas noted everything in his private journal, calculating profit margins alongside casualty numbers. By late July, he had become something new, a child who understood how to turn information into death. He no longer needed his father's guidance. He began manipulating entire communication networks across the frontier, feeding selective truths to each side. He'd tell the British that French troops were gathering near Albany, then tell the Mohawk that British scouts were planning raids on their hunting camps. The result was always the same: panic, conflict, and more demand for weapons. When he heard that a Huron war party planned to raid the Henderson family's isolated farm north of Fort Hunter, Jonas saw another opportunity. He sent a friendly warning to Thomas Henderson through a Dutch trader, hinting that French agents were nearby. The warning made Henderson rally his neighbors, forming a small militia of 12 armed men. Then, Jonas told the Hurons that the farm was full of British officers. The attack was devastating. Henderson and 2 of his children were killed, along with several warriors. In the aftermath, both sides believed they'd been ambushed. Within a week, Hamish sold more guns than ever before. Jonas was learning faster than anyone could imagine. He began mapping trade routes, rival merchants and supply chains, studying how information moved between Montreal, Albany, and the native settlements. He discovered that by manipulating that flow, he could destroy competitors while enriching his family. His next target was Isaac Clark, a struggling German trader near the Noses settlement. Clark had been approached by French agents offering to store weapons at his post. Desperate for money, he agreed. Jonas found out through Mohawk contacts and saw the perfect trap. He told the British that Clark was collaborating with the French. At the same time, he told the French that Clark planned to betray them to the British. On August 23rd, Colonial militia raided Clark's post at dawn, finding hidden muskets. Just as they began seizing the weapons, a Huron war party, believing the British had stolen from their French allies, attacked. The crossfire killed soldiers, warriors, and Clark himself. Hamish absorbed Clark's trade routes and customers within weeks. Jonas's manipulation reached new heights. He began tampering with convoy schedules, falsifying reports and timing intelligence leaks to cause chaos. A merchant in Albany named Samuel Wells was secretly gathering information for British intelligence. Jonas used him too, passing false reports to the French about British supply convoys. By August of 1745, Jonas Kryton was no longer a child on the frontier. He was the quiet storm moving beneath it. Every trade deal, every skirmish, every rumor seemed to lead back to him, though no one suspected. He'd learned that lies didn't need to be big or dramatic to work. They just had to sound like the truth people already feared. He had mapped out the entire web of trade and communication that stretched across New York's wilderness. From the German settlements in the east to the French garrisons near Lake Ontario, from the Mohawk villages to the British forts, Jonas knew who talked to whom and what they wanted most. He'd begun to treat the region like a chessboard. Every trader, soldier, and warrior was just another piece to move. One of those pieces was Abraham Yates, a Dutch merchant who worked out of Schenectady. Yates had recently begun securing weapon contracts for the British Army. Another was Samuel Wells, the English trader in Albany, who had been asking far too many questions about French weapon supplies. Jonas understood both men's ambitions, and he knew how to make those ambitions collide. He fed bits of true information to each, altering just enough to twist meaning and timing. To Yates, he hinted that Wells was quietly supplying the French. To Wells, he suggested that Yates was selling out to the Dutch. Neither man had reason to doubt him. He was a boy, after all, harmless, polite, and eerily well-informed. Then Jonas used them both. He leaked word of a supposed French supply convoy that would be traveling south under light guard. Wells passed that intelligence to British officers who planned an ambush. But Jonas had also told his French contacts that a large British troop convoy would be moving north through the same area, carrying critical supplies. When both forces met on the road that September, chaos erupted. The British thought they were ambushing a small French patrol. The French believed they were defending against a massive attack. By the time the gunfire stopped, both sides had lost men, wagons, and weeks of supplies. Among the dead was Samuel Wells himself, the man Jonas had used to make it all happen. Hamish Creighton's warehouse was empty by the end of that week. Every faction came begging for replacements. British commanders ordered new muskets by the dozen. French agents offered double the price for powder and ball. Native leaders paid whatever they could for weapons to defend against whichever enemy the rumors said was coming next. For Jonas, it was perfect. The more blood that spilled, the higher the prices climbed. The cycle was self-sustaining now, violence feeding business, business feeding violence. He no longer needed to start fires. He just had to fan the flames already burning. But Jonas's real brilliance was about to emerge. He began to see that battles didn't have to be fought with weapons. They could be fought with words, tiny distortions of truth that could pit entire nations against each other. And nowhere did that matter more than between the British and their most valuable allies, the Oneida. For years, the Oneida had supported the British cause, providing scouts and warriors for their campaigns. But their loyalty was fragile. They had watched British forts spread deeper into their lands, watched settlers edge closer to their hunting grounds. Jonas understood that suspicion. He knew how to twist it. Through his Mohawk contacts, he learned that one Oneida leader, Shenandoah, was worried about British plans to build permanent outposts on tribal land. Jonas used that fear like a blade. In conversations with Oneida messengers, he began asking careful, innocent questions. He mentioned British forts being built near the lakes, wondered aloud if those soldiers would ever leave once the war was done. The questions sounded harmless, but they planted seeds of doubt. To the British, he whispered something entirely different, that the Oneida were secretly negotiating with French emissaries. Both stories were partially true, just stripped of their context and polished into something more dangerous. By early October, tensions reached a breaking point. A meeting was held between British officers and Oneida representatives. Jonas had made sure that Captain Edmund Stockwell, the same officer who'd once accused Hamish of treason, was there. Stockwell entered the council already suspicious. He demanded that the Oneida prove their loyalty. Shenandoah, convinced now that the British planned to seize his lands, refused. The meeting collapsed in fury and mistrust. Within days, the Oneida withdrew their promised warriors from a planned campaign, leaving the British exposed. The French, sensing weakness, moved quickly to strengthen their alliances. Jonas had managed to fracture a relationship that had taken decades to build. He recorded the results in his journal, the number of weapons sold after the diplomatic breakdown, the routes new traders were forced to use, and the growing dependence of both sides on his father's supplies. Every death was just another entry in his ledger. Jonas had discovered something revolutionary, something even he barely understood at the time. He had proven that information itself could be a weapon, that a well-placed rumor could achieve what no army could. Centuries before the term existed, an 11-year-old boy had invented information warfare. By late September, his operations had evolved into what he privately called the Echo method. He would take one piece of intelligence, change it slightly, then send it to multiple sides. Each time the story echoed back, it carried new distortions, until the truth disappeared entirely. And in the chaos that followed, Jonas profited. When he heard that Captain Stockwell was planning an offensive near Lake George, Jonas went to work. He spread a quiet story among his Mohawk friends that the British were preparing to seize their hunting grounds under the pretense of building forts. Then, to his British contacts, he whispered that the French had recruited Mohawk warriors to fight against them. Both rumors were half true, but together they created a storm. On the morning of the battle, British forces waited for Oneida support that never came. Instead, they faced unexpected resistance from Mohawk fighters who believed they were defending their land. The result was carnage. Dozens died and nothing was gained. In the week that followed, Hamish Creighton's trading post did record business. The British bought every musket in stock. The French ordered gunpowder in bulk. Mohawk and Oneida leaders purchased pistols and blades. Jonas wrote it all down carefully, not as tragedy but as arithmetic. For every 10 dead men, he calculated his father's profits rose by a certain percentage. For every broken alliance, prices climbed even higher. To him, human life was an economy. By October, the first frost had settled over the Mohawk Valley, and the nights grew longer. That was when Jonas learned about a French supply convoy under the command of Captain Jacques-Pierre Taffanel. 40 soldiers were moving south from Montreal with winter provisions and payroll for the French forts. It was a valuable target, and Jonas immediately saw the potential. He began studying every detail: when the convoy would travel, what routes it might take, how quickly news of its movements would spread. He realized he could use this single event to pull together everything he'd learned: deception, timing, and human fear. To the British, he leaked word that the convoy was lightly guarded and carried a chest of gold worth thousands. To the Mohawk, he claimed it was a peaceful trading expedition bringing much-needed supplies for tribal families. To the French, he warned that British patrols planned to ambush them along the route, urging them to move faster and with fewer men. Each version of the story was built from fragments of truth. The convoy really was valuable. There really were British patrols nearby. There really were Mohawk families in need of supplies. Jonas simply rearranged the facts like a deck of cards until everyone saw what they most wanted, or feared, to see. By late November, 3 forces were unknowingly marching toward the same place: Deer Creek. The French convoy, the British ambush, and a Mohawk war party that believed it was going to protect its people. Jonas had calculated the timing down to the day. He wrote in his journal that week, noting how each group believed it was acting in defense, not aggression. He had set the stage perfectly. There was no turning back. On the night before the massacre, the boy stood near a ridge overlooking Deer Creek, watching the French campfires flicker in the distance. He was only 11, but his eyes were steady, his expression calm. He had done it. He had made soldiers, warriors, and nations dance to a tune only he could hear. When dawn broke on November 23rd, the first musket fired. No one knows who pulled the trigger. Within seconds, the valley exploded into chaos. The French, thinking they were under attack, formed defensive lines. The British charged, believing they were seizing a treasure convoy. And from the west, the Mohawk descended, thinking they were saving a peaceful trade caravan from slaughter. Gunfire rolled through the fog for 6 hours straight. When it ended, the ground was soaked in blood. 31 French soldiers were dead, including Captain Taffanel. 28 British men lay lifeless, along with Lieutenant Colonel Johnson himself. 17 Mohawk warriors were gone. 9 Oneida fighters died trying to protect allies who were no longer sure who was who. When the smoke cleared, all that remained were broken bodies and unanswered questions. Survivors from every side gave conflicting stories, each convinced the others had betrayed them. Back at Fort Hunter, Jonas sat in his father's study, quietly updating the ledgers. 85 dead, 7 new weapon orders, 3 separate armies demanding more supplies. To him it wasn't horror. It was success. The Deer Creek Massacre shocked the colonies. For the first time, the scale of the violence forced the governor of New York to take notice. An investigation was ordered, led by a man named Major Samuel Wells, the same name that had appeared months earlier in Jonas's web of victims. But this was not the same Wells. The original had died in Jonas's earlier schemes. This was his cousin, a disciplined officer sent from New York City to make sense of what had happened. He arrived in Fort Hunter determined to find out how 3 armies could end up in the same place at the same time, each convinced they were fighting in self-defense. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Major Samuel Wells began his investigation in early December, arriving at Fort Hunter under a heavy sky that promised more snow. The valley was still scarred from the Deer Creek Massacre. Burned wagons dotted the frozen fields. The few survivors spoke in fragments, their accounts tangled in contradiction. The French swore the British had set a trap. The British insisted they'd been ambushed by the French. The Mohawk and Oneida claimed they'd been lured into a battle that made no sense. Wells was a veteran soldier, sharp and methodical, not easily fooled. He'd fought in Europe and knew that coincidences of that scale never happened by chance. He wanted to understand how three forces, each acting on separate intelligence, could converge so precisely in one valley at the same hour. The trail led him straight to the one place that connected them all, Hamish Creighton's trading post. Hamish greeted the Major nervously. His business had suffered no visible damage from the chaos. In fact, his storehouse was full again, stocked with new shipments of muskets and powder from Albany. He cooperated fully, providing ledgers, receipts, and correspondence. Everything appeared legitimate, though the timelines were strangely perfect. Weapon orders placed days before attacks even began. At first, Wells thought Hamish might be the mastermind. The man was intelligent and had a motive: money. But as he read deeper, the inconsistencies became too intricate, too precise for an ordinary merchant. Each communication chain seemed to twist back on itself, as if someone had been editing both sides of the story. Someone fluent in multiple languages, someone who moved easily between soldiers, traders, and tribes. It was during an interview with Mohawk representatives that the truth began to take shape. Wells sat in the meeting room, listening as a young interpreter translated their complaints about lost trade goods and missing payments. The boy was pale, composed, with a calm voice that carried more confidence than his age should have allowed. His name, they said, was Jonas Kryton. Wells watched him closely. The boy didn't just translate words, he shaped them. Subtle changes in phrasing turned neutral statements into accusations, softened anger into sorrow, or twisted gratitude into suspicion. A sentence about British troops borrowing food became a claim that they'd stolen it. A promise of peace was rendered as a demand for restitution. The Major, fluent in Mohawk from his own service, recognized every alteration. And in that moment, he understood that he was not watching an interpreter. He was watching the invisible hand that had been manipulating the entire frontier. That evening, Wells requested a private conversation with the boy. Jonas arrived quietly, his manner polite, his grey eyes steady. He did not appear frightened. The conversation lasted hours. In his report, Wells described it as one of the most unsettling experiences of his life. Jonas spoke with the detached calm of a scientist explaining an experiment. He described how he learned to use information as a weapon, how truth, when divided into pieces and rearranged, could kill faster than bullets. He spoke of manipulating traders and captains, of timing messages so that no one would ever see the full picture. When Wells asked him why, Jonas didn't hesitate. "Because it worked," he said simply. "People believe what they already fear. I just gave them what they expected." He admitted to orchestrating the Vanderburg killings, the Henderson raid, the collapse of the Oneida Alliance, and the Deer Creek Massacre. To him, they were all parts of a larger experiment, to see whether human behavior could be predicted and controlled. He had no remorse, only pride in the precision of his results. He explained his philosophy like a teacher giving a lesson. "Information is like gunpowder," he told the Major. "Use a little at the right time and you can move mountains. Dump too much all at once and it just explodes in your face." He even shared his calculations, the ratios between casualties and sales, between fear and profit. Each number represented lives traded for silver. Wells realized the boy had turned human conflict into an equation, one he understood better than any general alive. By the time Jonas finished talking, the Major knew two things: that this child was guilty of crimes too vast for any trial, and that revealing them publicly would destroy the fragile colonial order. If the truth came out, that an 11-year-old boy had manipulated British intelligence, French command, and entire native nations, It would shatter every remaining thread of trust. Wells brought his findings to Governor George Creighton in New York City. The two men met behind closed doors, and the decision was swift. The official report would blame the Deer Creek Massacre on communication errors and unfortunate timing. The records mentioning Jonas Kryton were sealed by gubernatorial order. But that left the question of what to do with the boy himself. Executing him was out of the question. No colony would hang a child. Imprisoning him publicly would only invite attention, so they chose a simpler solution. Jonas Kryton would cease to exist. In January of 1746, Colonial records list Jonas's death from a fever outbreak that had supposedly swept the valley. A small funeral was held at Fort Hunter. Only a handful of people attended. No marker was placed on his grave. The truth was far more secretive. Jonas was quietly taken to Virginia and placed under what officials called protective custody in a secure house near Williamsburg. The plan was to study him, to understand how he had achieved such control over information, how he could read and manipulate people with surgical precision. For 2 months, various officers and scholars interviewed him daily. They asked about his methods, his thoughts on war and trade, his understanding of fear. Jonas answered everything with unsettling calm. But as time passed, his interviewers began to notice something strange. The questions started turning around. Jonas began asking about their families, their military ranks, their supply routes. They realized too late that the boy was studying them now, learning how their system worked, who reported to whom, where the gaps in authority lay. They started rotating guards, limiting contact, keeping him isolated. It made no difference. On the night of March 3rd, 1746, the house was silent. By morning, Jonas was gone. His room was perfectly clean. The window was unlatched, but the snow outside was untouched. No footprints, no broken locks, no signs of escape. He had simply vanished. Search parties scoured the woods for weeks. Notices were sent to neighboring colonies. Not a trace was ever found. Some claimed French agents had kidnapped him for revenge. Others whispered that Mohawk warriors had finally learned the truth and taken justice into their own hands. But one theory, written in Major Wells's private correspondence, was more chilling than all the others. That Jonas hadn't been taken at all. That he had simply walked away back into the wilderness to continue doing what he did best, making people destroy each other. For 77 years, his name was never spoken in public again. The official story of the Deer Creek Massacre remained unchallenged, a tragic accident of war. But in 1823, the secret resurfaced in the most unexpected way. An old Mohawk man lay dying in a small mission settlement. His name was Colonial, the brother of a war chief who had died at Deer Creek. The man had carried guilt for decades, and now, near death, he wanted to confess. He told his story to a missionary named Samuel Kirkland. According to the old warrior, there had been a child in Fort Hunter who spoke like water and struck like lightning. A boy who turned tribes and armies against one another with nothing but his words. He did not die, the elder whispered. I have seen his shadow in other wars. The evil that small hands do does not die with the hands that made it. Kirkland wrote down the confession, sealed it, and sent it to his superiors with a warning that the story was too dangerous to share. It stayed hidden in church archives until 1968, when researchers accidentally uncovered it. The transcript matched too many known details to be coincidence. No one could prove Jonas was behind them, but the pattern was undeniable. Someone had learned from him, or perhaps had become him under another name.